Welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I am Mike.
And we are going through the book of Galatians. We're in chapter 2. We're now in verses 11 through 21. And I'll just go ahead and read really quick those verses, and then we'll give it to Mike for an introduction and the first verse. So it goes, starting at verse 11. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that, certain men from James did he eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas was also carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are Jews by nature, and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by faith of Christ, and not by the works of law. For by the works of law shall no flesh be justified. But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain.
All right. Good stuff there. Good stuff. So that, of course, are the verses we're going to be looking at here. Just by way of giving us some background where we've come so far, let me sort of give you an overview, right? So we've done the first two shows, the first two hour-long things were over chapter 1, where we had an introduction, and then the first verses 1 through 5, we had Paul's greeting, and then we had his astonishment at their lapse from the gospel of grace. That is, the Galatians' lapse from the gospel of grace. And then in the first part, we see Paul defending his authority of his gospel and his calling from all the way up to the end of chapter 2, verse 21 here. But that really starts at chapter 1, verse 11, and goes, as I said, to chapter 2, verse 21. We see that in chapter 1, verses 11 through 24, we see him talking about what was revealed to him by Christ. And then we see in chapter 2, verse 1 through 10, we see he talks about how it was recognized and ratified by James, Peter, and John. And today, what we're going to be looking about is sort of the vindication, his vindication there in his conflict with Peter. So we'll kind of be dealing with that for these next 11 verses. Okay, so verse 11, chapter 2 in the book of Galatians. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. So Cephas / Peter came to Antioch specifically. Now, this is actually one of the verses that people use to defend the idea that this letter was to the churches in the district of southern Galatia. Remember, we gave just a brief mention that some people feel that this letter was to the Gauls in the northern Gauls there in northern Galatia. I mean, here is a city actually named. As well as the idea was that Paul was not just talking to those of the concision, but increasingly what you see these days is Bible scholars thinking that there was a double-edged idea here, that there might have been actually some Gnosticism involved as well, as some scholars have contended. Although I don't know if I buy into that just yet, to be honest. In that Peter came to Antioch and seemed to be carried away with this heresy, and given the resistance from the mindset that Jews had about Gentiles being unclean, it's entirely probable that this mindset would be deeply ingrained in the Jewish mindset, and especially in Peter. Gnosticism, however, Jews rejected that as well. So that's, I don't know, it just doesn't seem to make sense, though more and more people seem to be talking about that these days. It's also interesting how strident this language is. Paul says here he opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. In the gospel of grace, there is only one way, through grace, with all other roads leading to condemnation. It's also interesting to see the deep contrast here to what I call the language of reconciliation that Paul uses later in this letter and elsewhere. It seems for Paul that he was willing to compromise on a great many things for the sake of the gospel and the gospel of grace, and to even overlook some sins that we today would call pretty major, but he was absolutely not willing to compromise on the gospel of grace. And we see that here in verse 11, because he opposed Peter to his face because he stood, as Paul writes, condemned, not just out of the, not just a little bit out of the pocket. He stood condemned. Chris?
Very good. Now that term, I withstood him to the face. Now Paul makes a point to tell us that he confronted Peter not only to his face, but also publicly, which he will soon say in verse 14. Paul was confronting probably the most famous Christian in the world, Peter, who tended to be the spokesman of the apostles, like at Pentecost, when he sort of was the guy that basically started speaking for all of them there at Pentecost. This is also contrasted with Paul, who at this point in time had not gone on any of his missionary journeys and was relatively unknown, other than the possibility of people knowing him because he was a pastor at apparently pretty thriving church at Antioch, or because he's the guy that used to be a Pharisee and used to persecute Christians, but now is a pastor. So he's a relatively unknown guy confronting this great pillar of the apostles. Also, because he was to be blamed, as the King James renders it, this is a great apologetic argument against the Pope being infallible, because, as you know, the Roman Catholics believe that Peter was the precursor to the popes. And this is also an argument against, and clearly Peter was in error here. This is also an argument against the idea of Christians achieving sinlessness, which is sort of a fringe theory. But Peter, at this point in his life, was filled with the Spirit. This is post-Pentecost. This detail is important because, as I just mentioned, the Roman Catholic Church often will who holds this view of infallibility of the Pope, says that Peter's obvious slip-ups in the Gospels, like, all the stuff that he would do then, was pre-Pentecost. But as we will see, this confrontation is a sign that same foot in his mouth Peter is still had these types of moments. As you mentioned, the language is really strong. That this term "to the face" is two Greek words here. And I'll read from this word study here. The meaning is rather expressed in the familiar phrase "faced him down." It is, however, rarely as strong as this in the New Testament. Rather before the face or in the face of, meaning simply in the sight or presence of. This person makes a really interesting argument here when he says the explanation that Paul withstood Peter only in appearance or semblance. So he quotes some of these commentators like Jerome, who wrote the Latin Vulgate used by the Catholic Church. He says, it's one of the curiosities of exegesis and was probably adopted out of some misplaced consideration for the prestige of Peter. Okay, Mike?
Interesting stuff. Let's see. Verse 12. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So Paul is making the point that it seems that Cephas seemed to be okay with eating with the Gentiles and interacting with them, but with the advent of what he calls certain men from James, his demeanor and his attitude and his behavior changes.